Manufacturing is getting modernized as companies look to boost process efficiencies, create more resilient supply chains, and, of course, reduce costs. Elon Musk redefined manufacturing through Tesla and SpaceX, where he leaned into new technologies to make his processes faster and better. The manufacturing sector is now starting to look to startups and SaaS solutions. Meet Renan Devillieres, CEO of OSS Ventures, which develops and scales technology-driven businesses in the manufacturing space. He joins us here on A Seat at the Table to talk about how startups are shaping the future of manufacturing. Renan discusses how manufacturers can navigate the evolving landscape of SaaS operations, what manufacturers might be overlooking about implementing SaaS in their businesses, and how even small manufacturers can use what is often seen as enterprise-level applications. To successfully implement any kind of new technology, you need to have the right people with the right skill set. Finding those people can be easier said than done, especially in areas where the technology is relatively new, so there are fewer people with experience using it. That's why so many leading companies turn to AsiaNet consultants for help in recruiting the best talent. AsiaNet's team has been doing executive search for decades, so they know the right people in each industry sector. I've seen them fill some very difficult to fill positions. To learn more, check out their website at asianetconsultants.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Meanwhile, let's sit down with Renan and find out why every manufacturer needs to think like a tech company. Renan, I am so happy that you're able to join us today. I think what you're talking about is so interesting to most of the people who are listening to this podcast. You know, we hear a lot about the importance of digitization. Everybody wants to make their supply chain more flexible, more resilient. Manufacturing is certainly under a lot of stress to be able to be more agile, to be able to adapt to so many different changes. And I think that, you know, a lot of it comes back to what you talk about with regard to SaaS software.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So perhaps we can just dive in and you can perhaps share with us what you see as how startups are shaping the future of manufacturing.
Yes, sure. So basically, startups are shaping the future of manufacturing in mainly two ways. The first is changing the product and generally putting more software in the product. So let's compare a Tesla. The share of the value added of the product brought by software, so the big computer screen, but also all the software that goes on in the car, it is a lot more than your typical General Motors or Ford car. So that's putting software and that software thinking in the end product. And so, for example, there are a lot of startups that are working in space, working in transportation, working in defense also. They are putting that software thinking to the physical world. The second way of shaping the future of manufacturing is putting software in the process, in the way people and machines work. And so let's take an example. You want to build a truck hull, okay? Either you do a lot of different parts and you weld them together, or you try to make it in one go. To make it in one go, you have to have software. And so the software will tell the big press, you go a little more there, a little less there, a little more there, a little less there. And so you adapt the process using software to each individual case of creating the hull. And so, for example, the tire maker Michelin is doing that. And so they are changing the processes to make it so that each tire is the same, even if the input, the material, the raw material is very different. And so this is really what we are seeing, changing the product, changing the process. And when I say process, I gave you examples of very physical processes. There are also a lot of non-physical processes, such as supply chain visibility, procurement, payment, and everything. But basically, those are the two big categories.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we often don't think of it like that. We think of tech as not being part of manufacturing. We sort of think of tech as Silicon Valley and electronics and all kinds of online apps that we're using for things other than manufacturing. So I'm really glad you pointed that out. Now, how would you describe the evolving landscape of SaaS operations?
So it's evolving every day, as you say, but there are a few very interesting trends going on. The first trend is that SaaS for manufacturing and operations is around 30% growth year on year. It's starting from pretty low, but it's going very high. And so if you look at other verticals, such as retail or advertisement, they all went through 10 years where a lot of SaaS were brought in their industry and really boomed. In manufacturing and operations, we are at the very start of that. The second trend that we are seeing, and very interesting, is if you look at the heavy hitters, SAP for ERPs, or Dassault System, or all those, they are all creating ecosystems to benefit from startups and from apps that are doing SaaS and to capture them in their ecosystem. This is the Salesforce playbook. Salesforce created Salesforce, a CRM, and then they said, all right, we are going to have a platform and you can benefit from our customers base, but we are going to take 30% of your revenue. And the same thing is happening with SAP. So clearly we see a trend of those ecosystems. Interestingly, a lot of machine makers, for example, I was talking yesterday with Rockwell Automation, very big company, they are trying to do the same. They say, okay, we are going to open source the data that is generated by our machines, and all the startups will be able to create apps on top of that data that is produced by my machines. So that's the second trend. And the third trend, which is actually really, really interesting, all leaders in manufacturing are shifting from digital is not my thing to digital is the thing. And this is in large part because of Tesla or SpaceX, because they showed that new manufacturing leveraging software was a game changer. And so what I often say is in the 70s, Toyota created a whole new way of doing manufacturing. It's called the lean, and the lean methodology, and it's a way of organizing the plants and factories and everything. And so in 20 years, every single guy in a factory said, okay, I'm going to implement lean. And Tesla is the Toyota of the 2020s.
I think that's a really good analogy. And I hadn't really thought about it until you framed it that way. Now, what do you feel that people either misunderstand or might be overlooking with regard to SaaS in manufacturing? I mean, are there any blind spots?
I would say that there are two main blind spots.
Okay.
The first one is user experience. The whole digitization is getting good data and good processes so you can leverage those data and do more with less, with AI and blah, 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 blah. But how do you get good data? You get good data because the users want to use your thing and input the right data. And so I was a factory director. I put X in fields that are a little star and said, you have to fill up that field. I put an X because, yeah, if you put an X in the field, you're never going to have any value going from that field. And so user experience, not defined as it's pretty, but defined as I am solving a real problem for a real user. So he or she is going to input the right data and I am going to be able to leverage on that. This is totally overlooked, especially in factories where the whole concept of having a little fun at the job is kind of foreign. So that's the first overlooked field. The second I would say is what is possible when you have data at scale. According to our database, so all of our solutions are live in a little over 1,000 factories in Europe and the United States. When you deploy at scale a SaaS solution, what you can do is really mind-blowing, but you have to deploy it at scale. You cannot say, oh, I'm going to put it in a little corner, I'm going to look, and then 3 years later, I'm going to do something. No, you have to deploy it at scale. Let me take an example. we have a software that is specialized in HR management for blue collars. So basically, you can train the blue collars. They can ask to be skilled up on the platform. You can have the up-to-date skills that they are doing and everything. Okay. One of our clients deployed that in 10 factories. And then he did real data analysis. His data analysis is that 35% of the workforce had skills that were going to expire in less than 5 years. So now that you know that, you put an at-scale training and retraining program in your 10 factories to be ready for the future. And this kind of action at scale, fast, because you have the right data, because you can act in the right way, is really what digital is for. It is not about gaining 5% in a given process. Yeah, that's nice, but this is not the point. The point is changing how you operate at scale.
I think that's really interesting. What happens to companies that are too big to be able to just do things manually, right? But yet they're a little bit too small for some of these enterprise solutions. It just may be that the solution is bigger than the problem. I know that's not a very elegant way to phrase it, but what do people do like that? Or are they just too small to be part of that digital SaaS sort of revolution, you might say?
Yeah, it's actually a very important issue. We are seeing that what we call mid-sized companies and big companies, so over 3 to 5 factories, they are the ones taking advantage of digitization a lot. Under that scale, it's very hard. And it's very hard because you have limited resources, you cannot do everything, you cannot launch too many projects. And so those companies are today not benefiting a lot from digitization. And so we are seeing a gap with a lot of big companies being upfront and knowing that they are better. What we are seeing also is that big companies are more often than not doing supplier development program in digital and saying, okay, this is your starter pack. You are going to use those 4 software and give us the data. And so we are going to work together in a better way. And what I find really interesting is that it already happened. It happened in the 60s. In the 60s, when factories were putting heavy machinery in all factories, big companies were helping smaller companies buy machines and training them on how to use that and doing this. And the same thing is happening today with digitization, because the companies that are too small for at-scale digitization are being helped by their clients when they are big.
I think that's very interesting. And it's an interesting way to look at it, because you don't really think about big companies sort of acting as, I don't want to say a big brother, but in a sense, pulling up the smaller company and allowing them to use a platform, so to speak, that the bigger one is built, and that eventually will circle back to being advantageous to the bigger company. So it's an interesting way to look at it.
And maybe I'll give you an example.
Okay.
So it's another market, but in the Chinese market, Shine, the textile and apparel company, they went to 10 billion sales in 4 years. Okay, how do you do that from a supply chain point of view? And the answer is they created an ERP for textile companies, and they are giving the ERP for free for their suppliers, and the suppliers automatically get new work orders based on Shine capabilities and what they want. And so today, they don't have a supply chain department. They have 10 data scientists managing directly the ERP of their suppliers. So that's very extreme as an example. But this may be the future we are heading into.
Wow. That's really interesting. Now, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges for startups and investors in the digitization of manufacturing? Where do you see things that people should be aware of that you would advise them to start looking at now?
So the first is vertical software for smaller companies. The rate of digitization of smaller companies is very low. And doing vertical software, which has multiple use cases for those clients, is a really, really big opportunity. That would be first. The second would be AI. Manufacturing is one of the biggest producers of data in the world. Manufacturing is actually where the first data centers were to make factory work. And so there are tons and tons of really good data that are not being leveraged. And the improvement in processing, production, and everything can be mind-blowing when you put the right use case to work. That would be second. The third one is supply chain.
Right.
Because of geopolitical uncertainty, because also of climate change, everything is changing in the supply chain. In the world of yesterday, you could have a plan, and for 8 years, you would stick with the plan, and things would be relatively the same from one day to another. This world is gone. Like, it's crisis mode every day, all day. And so the software stack that was used to manage supply chain was a software stack that was coherent with the world of yesterday, but it is not coherent with the world of today. So big, rigid processes, you can behave kind of a bad way with your supplier. This is gone. Like, suppliers choose their clients. Variability is the new name of the game. There is a crisis happening every other day. And so what is the software stack that goes with the new normal? So that is an immense opportunity.
I think that's really an interesting way to frame it. And I think you're absolutely right that we are seeing a rebalancing of the relationship between a supplier and a buyer. It's taking a little bit of time because, of course, in many sectors, we saw a huge buildup of overcapacity during the pandemic when consumers were buying like mad. And unfortunately, the supply chain seemed to think that they would continue. That's obviously proven not to be a very accurate forecast, but now there's a lot of oversupply. But you're right, that'll start to rebalance itself. And you will see, as you're pointing out, that suppliers have a little more say in the game.
Indeed.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about OSS Venture. What are you doing?
Sure. So OSS Ventures is a venture builder. So
Okay.
our job is to create startups, and we create them from scratch. So we visit factories all day. We have visited 860 factories in 3 years.
Oh, that's a lot.
Yes, that's a lot. And we scan for pain points and opportunities to launch companies. When we see a pain point that is the same in 40% of the factories we visit, and there is no satisfying company addressing that pain point in the market, then we launch a company, a startup. We co-build with 3 to 5 factories at a time, and we work until it works. And when it works, the company becomes a separate company. We hire a CEO and a CTO to run the company, and they go and they develop the company. We take 25% of equity for each company. And the numbers are pretty cool. We started 3 years and a half ago. We are live in 1,080 factories all over the world. And we created 15 startups, 8 of which did a Series A. Collectively, there are a little over 350 people working in all those companies. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Wow, very impressive. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on A Seat at the Table. I've learned a tremendous amount, and I think it's so exciting to see what's happening in manufacturing. We oftentimes look at manufacturing as sort of an old industry, so it is interesting that you're shining a new light on it.
Thank you. We hope so.
Yeah, and thank you again for taking the time to join us here on A Seat at the Table.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.